Have you ever felt the air change in a room the moment you walk in, like a decision just ended without you, like your name was the last thing they expected to hear? And have you ever had the quiet fear that the people you trust aren't planning with you anymore, but around you, assuming you won't notice because years have piled up on your back? I'm in my 70s and I've learned this much. Time doesn't just take from your body. It changes how people look at you, how carefully they choose words, how often they decide things are already handled. Start small. Pause before an answer. A glance exchanged over your shoulder. A smile that shows up on time but doesn't stay long enough to mean anything. I used to believe respect was permanent, that if you spent a lifetime keeping promises, putting family first, carrying responsibility without complaint, that bought you something unmovable. Turns out, for some families, respect has an expiration date, and no one tells you when it's close. My days had slowed by then. Mornings stiff, evenings too quiet, but my mind hadn't dulled. If anything, quiet sharpens you. You hear what's not said. You notice when conversations suddenly wrap up as you enter, when plans are spoken about you instead of to you. Anytime I asked, I got the same soft brush off. Don't worry about it. Or worse, you're just being sensitive. That word shows up a lot when people want you calm, not informed. From the outside, my family looked fine. Sunday dinners, check-in calls, plenty of "we love you" said like punctuation. But love doesn't rush you through your own questions, and it doesn't treat your home like a temporary stop while paperwork quietly moves elsewhere. I kept my mouth shut anyway. At this age, you learn that peace sometimes costs you clarity. The one person who didn't play along was my grandson. He was young, but he had that still, watchful way about him, like he was listening to things adults assumed kids miss. He'd sit with me without filling the silence, ask questions that sounded simple but landed heavy. One afternoon he said, almost offhand, "Grandpa, do grown-ups ever lie just to keep things easy?" I laughed because that's what you do when a truth shows up too early. But inside, something tightened. That question didn't come from nowhere. A few days later, I noticed folders stacked neatly on the side table, my name written on them in someone else's hand. No one mentioned them. That's when the pressure crept in. Not panic, just the sense that time was being organized without me. Then came the moment I still replay. As my grandson was leaving, he hugged me longer than usual, slipped his hand into my coat pocket like he was afraid someone might see, and whispered, "Please read it when you're alone." I didn't check right away. I sat there listening to the clock mark seconds like it was counting down to something already decided. Because when a child feels the need to leave you a secret, it means the adults have already chosen silence. And the reason I hesitated wasn't fear of being shocked. It was the heavier realization that whatever that note pointed to wasn't just about hurt feelings. It was about something being taken, something final, something they assumed I'd be too old to stop. It started the week they stopped asking and began informing. Not loudly, never that, but with a calm efficiency that felt practiced, like a plan finally put into motion. Appointments appeared on my calendar that I hadn't made. Bills were gathered, sorted, stacked neatly on the side table, my name written on the folders in someone else's handwriting. I was still invited to the table, but no longer trusted with the menu. Every update came wrapped in kindness, the kind that smiles while it steers you out of your own lane. "We're just trying to make things easier," they said, and I nodded because pushing back felt like being difficult. And at my age, you learn how quickly concern turns into impatience. The language changed before the actions did. I heard phrases like, "when the time comes," and "down the road," and "we've already talked it through," spoken softly, as if volume could soften consequence. My house, the same walls I'd paid for year by year, was discussed like a future asset, not a present home. They never said I was incapable. They didn't have to. Courtesy so thick it felt rehearsed did the job just fine. Conversations wrapped up when I entered the room. Decisions were presented as done. And anytime I asked for clarity, I got the same calm dismissal. "Don't worry about it." That word again. Worry. As if concern was a symptom, not a signal. The one thing that kept needling me was a single folder, tan, unmarked, always placed back in the same spot after someone else had gone through it. No one mentioned it. No one needed to. It sat there like a clock you're not supposed to hear ticking. Halfway through one afternoon, while the adults talked in that careful, pleasant tone they use when they think they're being reasonable, I noticed my grandson watching them. Not confused. Not bored. Watching. He leaned in close and asked, barely above a whisper, "Grandpa, why do they talk about you like you're not here?" I didn't answer him. Couldn't. Because that question landed with the weight of proof. Kids don't invent that kind of awareness, they absorb it. From that moment on, I stopped giving every detail equal weight. One thing mattered more than the rest: my signature. I realized it wasn't being requested anymore. It was being assumed. That's when the unease turned practical. Once a name stops being necessary, everything attached to it becomes optional. And sitting there, listening to polite voices move past me toward conclusions already reached, I understood this wasn't drifting toward something bad. It was approaching a line. One more step, one document finalized, one decision made official, and whatever control I still had wouldn't be delayed. It would be gone. I didn't read the note right away. I let it sit there, heavy in my coat pocket, because once you read something meant to stay hidden, you don't get to step back into the same room afterward. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that finishes your thoughts for you. And when I finally unfolded that piece of paper, I noticed how carefully the words were pressed, like he wasn't sure he'd ever get another chance. It began with an apology, and that stopped me cold, because children don't apologize unless they believe they're breaking a rule. He wrote that he didn't know how to say this out loud, that adults get upset when kids repeat things they weren't supposed to hear. He wrote that he loved me, that he didn't want me scared, but that he was worried I was being pushed into agreeing without knowing. I read that line twice, agreeing without knowing. He explained that he'd heard them talking late at night, voices low, words too big for him but intentions he understood. He mentioned the tan folder, not the bills, not the appointments, but something else tucked inside it. Something that wasn't temporary. I folded the note back up and stared at the wall, because the shape of the problem was suddenly clear, even if every detail wasn't. I didn't confront anyone. Not that night. Not the next day. That restraint wasn't weakness, it was necessity. People planning something irreversible count on emotion to rush you into mistakes. Instead, I started paying attention to timing. Where the folder went. Who handled it. How often it moved. And 2 mornings later, before the week was out, I saw it laid open on the table while someone stepped out of the room. My name typed neatly at the bottom of a document I had never seen, waiting for the one thing they assumed would come easily.
À signature.
That's when urgency replaced doubt. This wasn't care drifting too far. It was consent being bypassed. Whatever they were arranging didn't need my understanding, just my compliance. I finished the note that night. The last line wasn't dramatic or accusing. It simply said, "I didn't know who else would tell you." That's when the truth settled fully, not as shock, but as instruction. A child had taken a risk because adults had chosen convenience over honesty. And if I didn't move carefully now, deliberately, then the line I felt tightening would be crossed for good. Because once a signature becomes a formality instead of a choice, you don't lose a document, you lose your voice. The moment you realize people are moving pieces without your permission, you stop asking why and start measuring how far they've already gone. That was the shift for me. Not anger. Not panic. Calculation. I lay awake that night replaying details I'd ignored before. The confidence in their voices, the way answers came too quickly, the calm assumption that everything was already settled. By morning, it was clear this wasn't a new idea taking shape. It was an old plan finally feeling safe enough to surface. So I did the one thing they didn't expect at my age. I slowed everything down and got precise. I stopped reacting and started verifying. I pulled out old documents, checked dates, reread agreements I'd signed years ago when trust still felt mutual. I listened more than I spoke. I let conversations finish. And when someone says, "It's all taken care of," and you don't challenge it, they keep talking. That's when you learn who's confident, who's nervous, and who's just following instructions. A few days in, something else became obvious: urgency. Not loud, not obvious, but there. Extra check-in calls. Casual questions about whether I'd had a chance to look things over. A suggestion that we should wrap this up soon. Plans like this don't survive delays. They depend on momentum and the assumption that no one will slow the machine. That's when I made my first call, to the office listed at the top of one document I wasn't meant to see yet. The conversation was polite, professional, and revealing. What I was told was routine turned out to hinge on a single missing step: my consent. Without it, nothing moved forward. With it, everything became permanent. That was the line ahead of me, and I knew they had already circled a date on their calendar, because I heard it mentioned once and then carefully avoided. I didn't rush after that. Rushing would have confirmed every quiet assumption they'd made about me. Instead, I gathered facts and let the clock work for me. I made sure I understood every word on those pages before anyone could slide them across the table. Through all of this, I kept one thing steady: the way I treated my grandson. Same routines, same calm, same trust. Because whatever happened next, I wasn't going to teach him that honesty costs you safety. By the end of the week, I wasn't guessing anymore. I knew exactly what would happen once that date arrived. And I also knew that after it passed, without my signature, nothing could be undone or forced. Sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is nothing at all, because when people believe the ending is guaranteed, they stop paying attention to the details. That's the space I stepped into. I didn't confront anyone, didn't hint, didn't change my tone. I let them believe their timeline was intact, that the last step would happen the way they'd already rehearsed in their minds. Outwardly, I stayed agreeable, polite, thankful for the help. Inside, I drew a clean line between performance and reality. I watched how concern faded once compliance felt assured, how language shifted from suggestion to assumption. The folder appeared more often now, placed where I could see it, not hidden anymore. They spoke faster, more confidently, using words like finalized and once this is signed. The kind of language people use when they think resistance is no longer an option. I let that confidence grow. And when you stop pushing back, people fill the silence. One family member began explaining too much, justifying things no one had questioned. Another stopped explaining altogether, already acting as if authority had transferred. Someone slipped and mentioned an outcome before the step that was supposed to lead to it. That's not a mistake. It's a tell. Midweek, while they were focused on momentum, I made one quiet adjustment of my own. I started documenting conversations the way professionals do, not the way families pretend not to: dates, phrasing, and most importantly, contradictions. The same plan described two different ways on two different days. A timeline that shifted depending on who was speaking. A statement that couldn't be squared with what I'd already been told. That was the proof taking shape. Not one explosive moment, but a pattern no one could later deny. The pressure on their side tightened. Reminder calls, gentle nudges about keeping things moving. People acting in good faith don't rush signatures. They wait for understanding. The more they hurried, the clearer it became what this really depended on. I kept my grandson steady through all of it, same routines, same calm, because I wasn't going to let him think honesty leads to chaos. By the end of the week, I knew exactly where the collision would happen. It wouldn't be a confrontation. It would be a moment when they expected agreement and instead got a pause that forced everything into the open. When I stopped playing the role they'd written for me, the process itself would stall. And once that machine stopped, the cracks they'd ignored would be impossible to hide. There's a point where preparation stops being about protecting yourself and starts becoming about where you're standing when the lights come on, and I crossed it without announcing a thing. By then, I wasn't reacting to pressure anymore. I was deciding timing. I went back through the paperwork with fresh eyes, not skimming, not trusting memory, but reading the way someone reads when they expect every word to matter later. I asked questions in a steady voice and waited for answers to settle before I spoke again. That's when the picture sharpened. Nothing they were pushing forward could move an inch without me, no matter how settled they acted. So I adjusted access quietly. Who had copies, who didn't, who could speak for me and who suddenly couldn't. No speeches. No warnings. Order does more damage to bad plans than emotion ever will. I scheduled one meeting they didn't know about and moved one deadline they were counting on, just enough to see what would happen. The response came faster than I expected. A call that same afternoon. Concern edged with impatience. A reminder that sounded a lot like a probe, that told me everything I needed to know about where the leverage sat. I followed it by putting things in writing, short summaries, simple confirmations, nothing flashy. When words are written down, they lose the flexibility that dishonesty depends on, and people who were comfortable before suddenly get careful. One email did more work than a dozen conversations ever had. It asked for clarification on a point they'd always treated as settled. The reply avoided the question entirely. That avoidance was the anchor. From then on, every move I made was deliberate, calm, cooperative, unhurried. People planning to rush, you don't know how to handle steady ground. By the end of that stretch, the outcome they expected was no longer automatic. It was conditional, and they could feel the change even if they couldn't name it yet. The rehook came the morning I noticed a meeting added to the calendar. Mine included this time, there's already scheduled. No explanation attached, just a date that hadn't been there before. That's when I knew someone had finally noticed the machine wasn't moving the way it was supposed to. I didn't cancel it. I didn't comment. I simply showed up prepared. Control had shifted quietly back where it belonged. And now the clock wasn't only counting down for me. It was counting toward a moment when assumptions would have to face paper, timelines, and the uncomfortable fact that nothing irreversible happens without consent, no matter how confidently it's been planned. People assume the truth explodes. It doesn't. Most of the time, it just arrives quietly and waits to see who's prepared to deal with it. That meeting was presented as routine, a formality wrapped in politeness, the kind where everyone shows up already believing the outcome is settled. I walked in the same way I always had, calm, unhurried, and took my seat. The papers were stacked neatly, tabs placed with care, signatures anticipated. No one asked if I had questions. They asked if I'd brought my glasses. That small comment said more than any speech could have. I didn't argue or raise my voice. I asked for one clarification, then another, both reasonable, both simple. The answers came quickly and confidently, and each one conflicted with something I already had in writing. Someone laughed it off, tried to smooth the moment. Someone else leaned forward and said, a little too firmly, "This is standard procedure." That was the resistance, brief but telling. I slid one printed email across the table, not with drama, just enough for it to be read. The room changed. Confidence thinned. Eyes dropped. When timelines don't match and words don't line up, authority weakens on its own. I didn't say betrayal. I didn't accuse anyone of anything. I made one statement and let it stand. I wasn't refusing cooperation. I was simply not agreeing to something I hadn't been told about. Silence followed, heavy and unmistakable. Not confusion, recognition. They understood then that the momentum they'd relied on was gone. And without it, the plan had nothing to stand on. I felt it too. Not triumph, but release, like pressure finally lifting off my chest. I gathered my things, thanked them for their time, and stood. No door slammed. No threats followed. But something important broke, not emotionally, structurally. The process built around my assumed compliance collapsed the moment it met paper and patience. As I walked out, I knew the ending they'd been preparing was finished. The next part wouldn't be about revenge or payback. It would be about choosing what came next on my terms with clarity instead of haste. Sometimes the hardest truth to accept isn't that adults can lie. It's that a child can see it sooner than anyone else. After everything slowed down, what stayed with me wasn't the paperwork or the careful silence that followed. It was the reason any of it came to light in the first place. A boy who wasn't part of the conversations still understood enough to know something was wrong. My grandson didn't have words for control or intent, but he had a clean sense of fairness, and that cut straighter than all the planning around him. I kept thinking about the risk he took, slipping that note where it could be found, knowing he might get in trouble just for telling the truth. Adults like to believe courage grows with age, but sometimes it shows up early, before fear learns how to disguise itself as politeness. I made sure he was never questioned or cornered, never made to feel like he'd caused a problem. I didn't tell him what had stalled or which plans had unraveled. I just made sure he knew one thing clearly, that he hadn't done anything wrong. Families have a way of rewriting stories once power shifts, explaining things away as misunderstandings or rushed decisions made with good intentions. But a child's honesty doesn't bend like that. It stays straight. And somewhere in the days that followed, something settled for me that couldn't be undone. Once someone shows you they're willing to deceive quietly, you don't owe them the same access anymore. Not to your decisions, not to your trust, not to your future. The conflict didn't disappear. It changed shape. This was no longer about exposing anyone or proving a point. It was about boundaries, clear ones that don't need explaining. I shared less. I spoke more carefully. Information became something earned again. Through all of it, I watched my grandson, not with worry, but with reassurance. I wanted him to see that telling the truth doesn't always lead to chaos. Sometimes it restores order where it belongs. The adults in the family grew quieter, more cautious, but the real shift wasn't theirs. It was mine. I no longer needed to wonder who valued me and who saw me as expendable. A child answered that with a folded piece of paper and a courage he shouldn't have had to find so early. And once you learn where honesty truly lives in a family, you stop chasing approval, you protect alignment. The quiet part people rarely talk about is what comes after control is reclaimed. When justice doesn't announce itself or demand applause, it simply settles in and stays. That's where I found myself. There was no final confrontation waiting in the wings, no dramatic moment of exposure, just a series of small, deliberate adjustments that reshaped everything for good. Access narrowed, decisions slowed. Invitations that once arrived automatically became intentional. I didn't explain myself because explanations invite negotiation, and this wasn't something to be bargained over anymore. The family felt the change almost immediately, not as punishment but as absence. The absence of assumption, the absence of entitlement. Phone calls grew more careful. Questions replaced instructions. Certainty gave way to courtesy. And that shift told me more than any apology ever could. When someone finally asked if things were okay between us, I understood something that had taken years to learn. Justice doesn't require agreement. It only requires boundaries that hold. I didn't correct anyone's version of events or defend my decisions. I let the new reality speak for itself. The systems that had been quietly built around me adjusted to those limits and didn't break. They simply began working the way they should have all along. What surprised me most was the calm. Not relief exactly, but steadiness. The kind that comes when your voice is no longer optional or assumed away. I didn't take anything back out of spite or shut anyone out for revenge. I just stopped extending trust where it had been handled carelessly. That difference mattered, and it showed my grandson something I hoped he'd remember. Dignity doesn't come from winning or humiliating others, but from standing still when pressure tries to move you. By the time everything settled, no one needed to be taught a lesson out loud. The consequences were built into the new shape of things, quiet and lasting. And when I thought back to a folded note left by a child who simply wanted the truth to be seen, I knew this, being heard at last, was enough. There's a strange peace that comes when you realize the quiet years weren't taking something from you. They were sharpening what was left. I see that clearly now. Not in the paperwork or the meetings, not in the tension that once filled the room, but in the way being underestimated became my greatest advantage. When you reach this stage of life, people assume your strength has already been spent. They confuse patience with decline, calm with confusion, silence with surrender. I let those assumptions stand because dignity isn't about correcting every misunderstanding. It's about knowing which ones no longer deserve your energy. What stays with me most is how easily trust drifts when comfort replaces care, and how firmly it returns when you finally choose yourself without anger or spectacle. I didn't walk away bitter. I walked away clear, clear about who earns access to my decisions, who gets a voice in my future, and who only hears about it after choices are made. Aging teaches you that respect doesn't come from being loud or endlessly useful. It comes from being steady when others are rushing you toward an ending they've already written. I watched my grandson move through the house after everything settled, lighter somehow, no longer carrying a secret that was never his to hold. That mattered more than any outcome. What he learned wasn't about family politics or paperwork. It was about courage without cruelty and truth without performance. He saw that you don't have to burn bridges to stop crossing them. You simply decide where you stand. If there's a lesson in all of this, it isn't about revenge or even justice. It's about timing, about knowing when silence protects you and when it protects others instead. About understanding that your voice doesn't disappear with age. It waits for the moment it's actually needed. I don't regret being patient. I regret only the years I thought patience meant accepting less than I deserved. Now I live quieter but stronger, with boundaries that don't need defending and choices that don't need explaining. And when I think back to a folded note left by a child who trusted me with the truth, I understand this at last. Dignity isn't something your family grants you. It's something you keep, even when no one's watching, until the day someone finally realizes it was never theirs to take. By the time everything settled, I understood something I wish I'd learned sooner. Peace doesn't come from being understood. It comes from no longer needing to be. My days didn't grow louder or fuller, but they became mine again, shaped by choices that no longer asked for permission or explanation. At this stage of life, you stop confusing love with access and loyalty with silence. Comfort can be negotiated away. Dignity cannot. And when I look back, not at the conflict or the people who misjudged me, but at the moment a child trusted me with the truth, I know this much for certain: growing older doesn't mean shrinking. It means standing still long enough for the world to finally adjust around you.